In the early hours of October 2nd, 2001, a woman came home after a party, walked in through the back door, went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, and went to sleep. In the closed garage just outside that kitchen, a man was dying, trapped in her car windshield. Testimonies collected later indicate that she heard sounds coming from the garage during the night and did nothing. This is the case of Chante Mallard.
She was 25 years old in 2001 and lived in Fort Worth, Texas. She worked as a nursing assistant, owned her own house, had a car, and lived a life with no apparent major problems. Co-workers described her as quiet and reserved. Nothing about her stood out. She had no criminal record and no history of violence of any kind. On the night of October 2nd, she went to a party, drank heavily, and in the early hours of the morning, got in her car to drive home alone.
Gregory Glenn Biggs was 37 years old. He was born in England and had arrived in the United States some years earlier. At some point, he lost his housing and had been living on the streets of Fort Worth. He had a son named Brandon, with whom contact had been lost over the years. On the night of October 2nd, Gregory was crossing Camp Bowie Boulevard on foot.
The impact happened fast. Chante's car struck Gregory at high speed on Camp Bowie Boulevard, somewhere around midnight. The force of the collision was enough to throw his body against the windshield and partially drive him through the glass. He did not go over the car. He did not land on the road. He stayed there, lodged in the shattered windshield, his upper body pushed through into the car and his legs hanging outside. Gregory was alive. He was conscious. He was making sounds. Chante did not stop. She did not pull over, did not turn on the hazard lights, did not reach for her phone. What she did was keep driving. For several miles, she drove through Fort Worth in the middle of the night, with Gregory Biggs trapped in the windshield of her car, the wind hitting him, the glass pressed around him, the road moving beneath the wheels. Anyone who passed her on that stretch of highway and glanced over would have seen something that made no sense. Nobody stopped her.
When she reached her house, she pulled into the garage and pressed the button for the automatic door. The door came down behind her. She turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment. Then she got out of the car, walked past Gregory, went inside the house, and locked the door behind her. What happened in that garage over the next several hours is something the medical examiner reconstructed with a precision that is difficult to read. Gregory Biggs was alive when the garage door closed. The injuries he sustained in the collision were severe, but not immediately fatal. He was bleeding. He was in pain. He was trapped in a windshield, in a closed garage, in the middle of the night, with no way to call for help and no reason to believe anyone was coming. The medical examiner concluded that with emergency medical attention, Gregory would have survived. The window of time in which he could have been saved stretched across several hours. Chante was a nursing assistant. She understood trauma. She understood what untreated blood loss does to a body over time. Testimonies collected later from people she spoke to in the days that followed indicate she was aware Gregory was still alive when she went inside. She heard sounds coming from the garage during the night. She did not call 911. She did not go back out. She went to sleep. Gregory Biggs died alone in that garage before morning. When Chante woke up the next day, the problem was still in the garage. She called two men she knew, Tyrone Williams and Stanley Mosique, and told them what had happened. Not everything about what she told them is on record, but the result of that conversation is both men drove to her house. What followed was methodical. They removed Gregory's body from the windshield. This alone was not a simple task. The impact had driven him deep into the glass, and extracting him required effort and time. They placed him in the back of Tyrone's car, drove across Fort Worth to Cobb Park, carried him into the trees, and buried him in a shallow grave. They covered the grave, walked back to the car, and drove away. Back at Chante's house, they cleaned the garage. Then they took her car, a vehicle with a completely destroyed windshield and damage consistent with a high-speed collision with a human body, to a car wash. The car was cleaned as thoroughly as possible. A few days later, it was sold. Chante went to work. The particular horror of what happened next is not in the violence, but in the silence. Gregory Biggs was added to a missing persons list, and that was the end of it. No active investigation, no search, no urgency. People living on the streets of Fort Worth disappeared with some regularity, and the system did not always respond with the same speed it might for others. There were no witnesses to the collision. No cameras had recorded the impact. The car had changed hands. The body was under the ground in a public park that nobody had any reason to dig up. For almost a year, the case did not exist. Chante went to work, came home, lived her life. Tyrone Williams and Stanley Mosique said nothing. The shallow grave in Cobb Park held its secret through the winter, through the spring, through the summer. It held it until Tyrone Williams told someone. In July 2002, almost a year after the night on Camp Bowie Boulevard, the Fort Worth police received a tip from an informant. The story had traveled from Tyrone Williams through at least one other person before reaching someone who decided to go to the authorities. Investigators went to Cobb Park and found Gregory's remains exactly where they had been told to look. Chante Mallard was arrested in July 2002. Tyrone Williams and Stanley Mosique were detained shortly after. Chante's trial took place in 2003. and drew national press attention. The prosecution built the case around the medical examiner's report, and the central argument was the following. Chante was not charged for the collision itself, but for murder, because Gregory's death was not caused by the impact and was caused by the decision not to call for help. Gregory was alive when he arrived in that garage and died from a treatable injury. Chante had a background in healthcare, was capable of evaluating what she was looking at, and chose not to act.
The jury convicted her and sentenced her to 50 years in prison. Tyrone Williams was tried separately and received 60 years for helping dispose of the body, a longer sentence than Chante's, which generated public debate at the time. The legal explanation involves the specific charges against each defendant and the terms of the plea agreements. But for Gregory's family, that discussion did not change much. Stanley Mosaici cooperated with the prosecution during the investigation and received a reduced sentence.
Gregory Biggs was identified and buried after the case concluded. His son Brandon gave interviews over the following years and said that what he cannot get past is not his father's death, but knowing that there was enough time to save him, and that during that time, someone chose to close the garage door and go to sleep. Chante Mallard remains incarcerated in Texas. Requests for sentence review have been denied, and requests for parole have not been granted either. Tyrone Williams is also still serving his sentence. The collision itself could have had a different legal outcome. Accidents involving alcohol carry their own specific charges, and the consequences, though serious, are different. What turned this case into murder was everything that happened after the impact. Every decision made in the hours and days that followed. And what makes this case hard to let go of is that each one of those decisions had a clear moment of choice.